Welcome to CSIS. My name is Jim Lewis. I work here. Our first speaker probably needs no introduction, but I will introduce her anyhow. It's Jeanette Manfra, who's the Assistant Secretary of the Office of Cybersecurity and Communications at DHS, the Department of Homeland Security. She's the National Protection and Programs Director and Assistant Secretary, a long-time expert in the field, long-time public servant at DHS. We're very grateful that she took time today to come and speak to us. She has spent time at the White House in the past, at the National Security Council, and before working at DHS, she was in the Army, which is always a good recommendation. So with that, Jeanette, please.
Thank you. The most stressful part is making sure I don't trip on the stairs, so I accomplished that. Thank you all so much for being here, and thank you so much, Jim, for having me and for all the work that CSIS does in this space. I think it's really important to continue to engage with the policy community and those around here who are thinking about cybersecurity. And so I wanted to just spend a little bit of time talking about sort of what we do at DHS. Some of you are probably very familiar with that, probably more familiar than you would like to be. Some of you are new to cyber and what DHS does. So I wanted to just give you a little bit of background of what it is we do, why we do it, but then I really want to spend much of the time after that talking about where we're going and how important it is to continue to partner with folks like yourselves to get the best ideas. Cyber is a really challenging topic, both from a policy and an operational perspective. So looking forward to hearing some of your questions and engaging with you all in future dialogue. So I don't think I need to talk too much about the growing challenges in cybersecurity. Our threats are becoming more aggressive, more dynamic, more sophisticated. I'm going to spend today focusing on the federal cybersecurity aspect, but the department also has a very crucial role on critical infrastructure. So for federal cybersecurity, our role stems largely from authorities, a statute that Congress passed a few years ago, and I won't get into all of the specifics. For you lawyers in the room, I'm happy to go into more detail or connect you with our lawyers. But generally, the framework that is set up, which was reaffirmed in President Trump's executive order, is that the Office of Management and Budget is responsible for policy setting for federal cybersecurity, and the Department of Homeland Security is responsible for implementing those policies and assisting government agencies. But importantly, the agency head is responsible and accountable for their cybersecurity. And so we work to develop and implement these policies. We work with agencies to understand what capabilities they need, and we work to understand what capabilities DHS needs to provide. And this has been evolving significantly over the past decade. My organization has been around for a little bit over 10 years. When we first started, there was just 100 or so people that were pulled from different parts of the department or different parts of the government. Cybersecurity was really not on a very significant radar of folks across the country or leadership, and it's and our authorities and our capabilities and the understanding of what could be done and the potential of what could be done has really evolved. And I believe that we're in a very exciting place right now. And we have a tremendous amount of opportunities. We have broad authorities now. We've spent years developing capabilities, sensors that we're deploying across the federal government, and getting a lot of the basics right across the federal government. The government struggles, just like every organization, with how best to allocate limited resources. And I think what has been very important over the years is taking cybersecurity out of just a strictly technical issue and turning it into more of a risk management issue, and helping executives, whether it's in the government or in the private sector, understand how cyber is a broader risk management issue and how it impacts your mission. And so we spend a lot of time translating technical risk into the broader risk for enterprise management. So the couple of the things that we're very focused on in the new administration, Representative Hurd is also going to be talking about this a little bit later, but modernization. A lot of our vulnerabilities and our challenges stem from the government's dependence on antiquated infrastructure. And we need to ensure that we are deploying our resources to modernize the infrastructure, and modernize the technology that we're using, and modernize the way that we procure technology, and what is the relationship that we need to be having? How can we keep pace with industry? The government in different pockets has been looking at more cloud and mobile and adopting those sorts of solutions, and that's good, but we need to enable that across the federal government. So right now, one of the reports from that executive order, the IT modernization report, is out for public comment. We've been receiving comments, and we think that this is going to be a really powerful driving force for the government in the steps that we can take. We're going to be looking at much more shared services, looking at governance differently. And so I think as we think about modernizing our infrastructure, to sort of that last point on the governance, we also have to be thinking about modernizing everything else that goes along with that. The government generally has a very decentralized way of managing IT. And so we're thinking about, are we making the right policy and governance choices with IT? And why that's relevant to me is because how the government manages its IT and its OT capabilities directly then relevant to what I can do to make it more secure. So the more we modernize our IT systems, we do reduce vulnerabilities, such as the dependence on some of this legacy infrastructure. But if we're not also modernizing our security practices, we can, well, first we could reduce the benefits that we get from the efficiencies of this modernization, but we're also then not taking advantage of the more modern ways to secure that technology. So we're looking at it from both, thinking about how we are using technology, how we're modernizing the actual technology, how we're modernizing our processes. We have a lot of very bureaucratic processes. We're very compliance focused in how we think about cybersecurity in the government. And I don't think that's too different from how industry thinks about it. So where we're thinking of in terms of how the department then plays is, as agencies are sort of restricted in the resources, both from people and dollars in deploying cybersecurity capabilities, we're thinking differently about the role of the department in what we provide. So our sort of main programs were born out of a concept of a way to more cost efficiently and more scalable way provide services to the rest of the federal government. Some of you know of the Einstein Program, which is part of a larger national cyber protection system that we run. And this was based off of a way to sort of be able to have insight into the perimeters of agency networks. And so early, say 8-9 years ago, the government underwent an effort to reduce our exposure to the public internet, so sort of reducing the connections. And then we deploy sensors at those connections. And these are, this is NetFlow, this is intrusion detection, intrusion prevention capabilities that we're able then to deploy in a way that is looking sort of across the entire kind of perimeter of the various different government agencies. And that's a very valuable tool. It's, any organization that is doing cybersecurity, you have to do NetFlow analysis, IDS, IPS, and get those signatures, get better at those signatures. But we want to lean forward, and we want to think differently too, as the industry and government is moving away from perimeter-based defense, thinking about how do we take advantage of these cloud deployments? How do we take advantage of mobile? And so as we sort of pilot and look at different sort of, whether it's non-signature based or other ways of securing via the cloud, we're also deploying another program which I think is going to be really game-changing for the department and for the government at large. The president's executive order is very focused on, every agency, you have to manage your own risk. but we also need to be aware of enterprise risk. And that's where the department comes in. And we've had a couple efforts underway now, a couple of years, understanding what are those really high-value targets, if you will, in the government. What are those critical systems and functions that we perform? We're doing a similar thing in industry. It's sort of what the NIST framework tells us to do, right? Identify those assets that are most significant. So thinking differently about, in terms of the government is performing certain services and functions that citizens depend upon, or our national security depends upon. What are those services and functions, and what are their dependencies on data or systems to perform those? And then what are we doing to heighten the level of security to those assets? And so that's a driving force for us thinking a little bit differently about the relationship between the department and the agencies. And one of the ways that we're doing this is with our continuous diagnostics and mitigation program, which started off as a continuous monitoring as a service, for those of you familiar with that type of capability. But what it's really evolving into is an innovative way for the government to think about shared procurement, shared services, and deployment of consistent technologies. So for those of you who are less familiar with it, the Congress appropriates us money to then work with agencies, work with GSA. We build out a sort of set of large contracts and work with the agency and those integrators to identify the agency requirements, and then we're purchasing the tools. So that allows us to get tremendous purchasing power, because now you have the entire federal government. It's standardizing and having more consistent tools. It's also enabling access to capabilities that a lot of agencies didn't previously have access to. It'll get us to a point where we're moving out of a compliance-based security mindset into an operational security. That if you're continuously monitoring and you're setting your parameters, you as a CISO or a CIO will, and ideally as an executive, will have regular insight into how my systems are actually doing from a security perspective, not every 3 years going through a large checklist. As you all know who do this, you've got to always be looking at your systems, and every 3 years definitely is not going to do it for us. The second part of this is the operational capability. So what we're doing is we're deploying sensors inside agency networks for the first time. And we started with on-premise, and we're now moving into cloud and mobile. And we're deploying sensors that are allowing, automated hardware asset management, software asset management, identity authentication, and those sorts of capabilities that, again, will provide that security readiness posture for the CISO. But importantly, what will also happen, and that we're standing up next month, is what we call the federal dashboard. And what this will be a game-changing capability for the government and for DHS in particular, because now all of that data is going to feed up to the agencies, but it's also then going to feed to my organization's operations center, the National Cybersecurity Communications Integration Center. And so what we will then be able to do is have insight down to the endpoint of what's really on people's networks, who's on people's network, what events are happening on the network. And then my operators and analysts are then going to have this sort of much better enterprise picture of what our risk posture is as the government. And we've never had this before. And it's going to take us some time to continue to build this, both our own capability and other agencies. But this will then allow us to get from the point a couple of years ago where we had Heartbleed come out and we're searching for CIO phone numbers, to now I can have advanced awareness of a vulnerability that a security researcher comes to us because we have a protected space to share that information. I can go into our dashboard and know instantly who's running that version of that system and focus the agencies on protecting that asset. And that is completely different than we've ever had before. So we're very excited about that. Related to that is the information sharing. It is absolutely critical, of course, and we've spoken for years about the need for information sharing, from the intelligence community to us, from law enforcement to us, and back to them, from the private sector, et cetera. And where we're at right now is sort of on the precipice of having sensing data coming in from all agencies, information from the intelligence community, information from the private sector now through automated means, and we are now going to be able to be in a place to have this access to data and to begin to build an advanced analytics capability that can then turn that around into usable, actionable information for executives. And that's what we're going to be driving towards over the next few years. It's a lot of work. It's a lot of capacity and capability to build, but this is, I think it's a very exciting time for the department, and we need to kind of continue to lean forward and lean into our authorities, continue to build the resources that we need, continue to recruit people to come to the department. It's really cool. We're in Ballston. It's a good location to live if any of you want to work for us. And continue to expand this not just within the federal government, but then of course expanding this out into the critical infrastructure. And so I think I'll close there because I'd like to have some time for questions, but that's sort of where we're at and kind of our vision for where we're going in the future on federal cyber. 10-15 minutes.
So I should call her Assistant Secretary. The Assistant Secretary has 10 or 15 minutes for questions. Do we have anyone? Please raise your hand and identify yourself, please. So go ahead, you in the back. We'll get a microphone to you. I have a question too. So.
Hi, Tim Starks from Politico. I wanted to ask you about information sharing. I think everybody agrees there's been a lot of progress made there, but you still hear complaints from time to time about the usability of the information or the speed, or even in the case of the Grizzly Step, some confusion related to what was released. Can you talk about what you're doing to confront those challenges?
I would be happy to. It's my favorite topic. So one of the things about information sharing, I think part of the challenge is the term has been used so much that it's lost a lot of its meaning, if you will. So information sharing, obviously not just the ends. We're doing it in order to have better capability to defend our networks. And the way, if you think about it from sort of a intelligence perspective, right? You want to be gathering intelligence based off of the requirements of the end user. And that's what we need to be doing for information sharing. Whether it's information or intelligence, we need to understand what the requirements of the user are. And the way that, and increasingly think differently about consumers of intelligence and information. And so we spend a lot of time, particularly with agencies and with critical infrastructure, say, let's talk about what it is you need to best defend your networks. And at a granular enough level that we can then turn that into the indicators and warnings that we should be working to produce and working with the intelligence community to ensure that they know this is what the financial sector, this is how it works, and this is how data flows in the banking system, and this is to sort of similar to what we've done on the government side, also in the private sector. These are the services and functions and the systems that support it that are really critical. So we need to be looking out for threats and targeting of those systems. And that allows us to better refine what it is we're looking for and refine what then we're going to turn around. We obviously we continue to get better, I think, at declassifying or lowering the classification of information. We're getting faster about putting out sort of automated indicators. Indicators, very useful, but we need to be doing more. And I also really believe that the sort of the comparative advantage that the government has is around context. And we have a thriving cybersecurity and threat intelligence industry. And as industry is getting more and more insight, starting to think about them too as producers and information. And so I kind of see this cycle, right, where you've got people who are producing information that are ideally aligned with the requirements of the network defenders and who are those consumers. And whether you're in the government or the private sector, you still have that role to play. So it's continuing to bring them in. I think we've worked past most of the legal challenges that we had. The last legislation, the Cybersecurity Act, allowed for liability protections for sharing with the department, but that takes time for people to absorb. But we have a lot of people that are very interested. That program is growing significantly, but I don't want it to just stop with indicators. It's very important to have that automated indicator sharing ecosystem, but we need to kind of continue to focus on those kind of high value targets, who's targeting those, and how are we getting that information with the appropriate context to those network defenders, again, whether in the government or the private sector.
So my question is, what's on your wish list? I mean, and don't just say people. But what is it you'd like to have or that you need to do the job a little better?
Well, this is, people always laugh when I say this, but changing the name of our organization is actually really important to us, and we need Congress to act on that, and they are doing that. But the National Protection and Programs Directorate doesn't exactly roll off the tongue, and it doesn't exactly give you any sense of what it is we do. And so that's something that's really important. That's important for morale, for our own workforce. It's important for recruiting. It's important for people to understand what it is we do. And we're also building ourselves into an operational agency. And so sort of started off as a very headquarter policy-focused entity. And over the last decade, as I've kind of just talked about, we're much more of an operational entity. And so we're working closely with Congress and our leadership to sort of become the next agency within the Department of Homeland Security.
That sounds kind of familiar.
Mm-hmm. Still working on it.
We voted for a cybersecurity agency, which I know isn't original, but I think everyone would agree a new name would be good.
Yes.
We had a question there. Yeah.
Oh, and people.
Oh.
But you wouldn't let me say that.
So I'm Stephen O from CSRA, and you mentioned both operationalizing and kind of consolidating data to get a better view about what the landscape is and what threat models are. How does cloud play into that and modernization? Because the effort right now is to try and deprecate some legacy technology and move towards something that's more scalable.
Yes. I think we've seen a lot of success within the government for agencies who have been early adopters of cloud technologies. And we have to ensure that the challenge with cloud, so we have two challenges. One is one that we can deal with relatively easy, but sort of if you're adopting cloud, you're actually still required though to kind of go through the ticks, and so you're sort of reducing the benefit of having the cloud, but we're addressing that. But more importantly, the concern that I have is as we go to the cloud, which is very useful and cost effective, I need to ensure that there's a way for my organization to maintain visibility into that traffic, and what are those security standards that those cloud providers are adopting and abiding by. And so that's the sort of where we're thinking right now, is how do we take advantage of this capability that's more cost effective and you're just much more useful from a IT perspective in the government, but also not lose the insight that we need to have for government traffic.
Time for one more over there, and that'll be the last question.
Hey, my name is Hector from American Organization States, and at the beginning of your lecture, you say that you have a lot of bureaucratic process. How do you manage this in order to execute the project or the new issues, or how do you inspire your people to absorb this information more quickly? Thank you.
Yeah, so one of the messages that I tell all my folks is to question everything. If you are going through some process and you don't think this makes sense, think, is there a better way to do this? And because if we don't have, so that's sort of the first part of the answer, but if we don't have people who are actually in the sort of nuts and bolts of working these processes and these programs, and they're not sort of saying, hey, this kind of doesn't make sense. Maybe there's a better way to do that. We may be missing something. We may have no idea that we're wasting all sorts of man hours and resources around a process. The second part of that is there's a whole lot of them that we know are antiquated processes, and so we're working as a part of the IT modernization effort. Like I said, it's a lot about legacy infrastructure, but it's a lot about processes. So our ATO, so that's sort of the authority to operate process for the government, it takes a long time, and there is a lot of stuff involved in that, and we want to modernize that and make that more operationally relevant. How the ticks are done. A lot of these things, processes that were put in place where we can have them more automated, we can have people doing what people should do and computers doing what computers should do, and an oversight capability to ensure that that's all working right. That's where we're really trying to focus, is sort of coming at it from both ends. But this is a large priority, particularly because the security processes, if they're so cumbersome, you're just disincentivizing anybody from actually following them. And some of our most security aware folks will almost be the worst at following some of these security processes. And so I think then you've got something wrong there.
Thank you. Please thank me in joining us. Please join.
Thanks, Jim.
Hello, everyone. My name is Will Carter. I'm the Deputy Director of the Tech Policy Program here at CSIS, working with Jim. And it's my distinct pleasure and honor to introduce Representative Will Hurd, who's from the 23rd District of Texas. Representative Hurd is one of the leading voices in Congress on cybersecurity and technology issues, and has been involved in many of the very important efforts by Congress to address some of these challenges of federal government cybersecurity. He is the chair of the Information Technology Subcommittee on the Committee for Oversight and Government Reform, which is a key platform for addressing many of these challenges. And he has also sponsored a very critical bill called the Modernizing Government Technology Act, the goal of which is to give federal agencies some of those tools and resources that Jeanette talked about in order to address many of these challenges. So I will let his remarks speak for himself, but it is my pleasure to introduce Representative Hurd.
Thanks for having me, and happy Coffee Day to everybody. National Coffee Day, I think it is today. It's great to be here, and we're talking about a topic that is near and dear to my heart. And what I wanted to do is frame my remarks and go in my background just a little bit for those that don't know, and then talk about a couple of issues that I think are germane in the federal government when it comes to cybersecurity. So I'm from San Antonio, went to Texas A&M University. My degree is in computer science. So for some of y'all that are still students, if you need help with your Fortran 77 homework, let me know. I'm your guy. And then I had international studies as a minor, and I was exposed to the CIA my sophomore year at A&M, and went into the CIA when I graduated. So I was the guy in the back alleys at 4 o'clock in the morning collecting intelligence on threats to the homeland. Did 2 years at what I used to call our super secret CIA training facility called the Farm, and now it's on Google Maps. And I did 2 years in India, 2 years in Pakistan, 2 years in New York City, and then a year and a half in Afghanistan, where I managed all of our undercover operations. And in that process, being involved in intelligence, you always have to worry about counterintelligence. And so that goes for personal security, but your security of your digital information. So it's something that you learn intimately well there. And I was involved in some of the technical operations that we do. And I had to also brief members of Congress, and I was pretty shocked by the caliber of our leaders. And my mama said, you're either part of the problem, part of the solution, so I ran for Congress. And I lost by 700 votes, which is not a lot of votes. But it gave me an opportunity to become a partner in a consulting firm. We helped our clients grow into markets they had never been in before. And many of our clients came to us and said, hey, we have cybersecurity issues, can you help? And we were all a bunch of former CIA officers, and being good former CIA officers, we said we know a guy, and helped start FusionX, which was a cybersecurity company. It did technical vulnerability assessments, penetration testing, things of that nature. And it was a great experience, not only to help start a company flat-footed, but to understand the threats that are out there to the private sector, but also the talents that is out in the private sector. And the opportunity came to run again in 2014. I took it, and this time I won. So I've been in Congress for 2.5 years, and a lot of people know me as the IT procurement guy. I've done 50 parades in my district. My district goes from San Antonio to El Paso, 29 counties, 2 time zones, 820 miles of the border. And not once in one of those 50 parades has anybody ever held up a sign that said IT procurement, you know. But when you tell folks that the federal government spends $90 billion a year on purchasing IT goods and services, and 75% of that is on legacy systems, people are immediately outraged. And when you look across the federal infrastructure and realize they're using, you know, they're not using some of the most basic things when it comes to good digital system hygiene, it's pretty outrageous. And so that's why one of the things we've been working on, and we're excited because it just passed the Senate, is this Modernizing Government Technology Act. Real simple. If a federal CIO saves money by modernizing their infrastructure, the money they save can be put in a working capital fund, and they have access to it for 3 years. Most people are like, why aren't we doing that already? But this is something that is going to give our federal CIOs a new tool to do their job. Part of the problem we have in defending our digital infrastructure is that our CIOs don't have all the authorities that they need. We also have CIOs that don't report directly to the agency head or the deputy agency head. These are real problems because that shows that management in these organizations don't appreciate or are not having cybersecurity be a C-suite issue. So we have to take care of some of the most basic things but we should be talking about how are we going to stay and how are we going to win the war when it comes to quantum computing. Quantum computing is going to be here sooner than we expect. It is going to upend and change how we do encryption. It is going to change the nature of how we operate on the digital divide, in the digital space, excuse me. And Vladimir Putin recently said that whoever masters artificial intelligence is going to be running the show. The true hegemon is going to be based on quantum computing. And we have to make sure we're doubling down on basic research. We have to be making sure that we're understanding this technology because it's going to be here sooner than we expect. The other thing we have to do is make sure that we have the talent that we need in order to defend our digital infrastructure. One of the first hearings I held was, we have this thing called FITARA. FITARA is basically, it was a piece of legislation to empower federal CIOs, and we grade the agencies on about 7 of those principles. And we had the head of the Social Security Administration, the CIO for Social Security Administration, excuse me, in front of the committee, and they had just done, in partnership with DHS, a technical vulnerability assessment. And my first question was, how many critical vulnerabilities? I said, how many vulnerabilities did you identify in your recent test? The response was, I don't know. I said, okay. How many critical vulnerabilities did you identify? Critical vulnerability is something that when I was in the business, if we found a critical vulnerability, we would stop and say, hey, it's got to be fixed right now. The response was, I don't know. And so I kind of lose my cool, and I was like, well, what are you doing to defend our infrastructure? And the response was many different things. For those of y'all that are not technical, that is not a technical answer to a technical question. And so we have to make sure we have the right people in these positions. In the federal government, GAO says there's about 15,000 positions unfilled. That's a problem. And so one of the things that we're trying to do is now that we have the Modernizing Government Technology Act basically across the finish line, we're going to start working on this concept of a cyber national guard. It's real simple. If you're in school and you want to get a degree in something related to cybersecurity, we're going to try to find you some federal dollars to get a scholarship. But for however many years you got federal dollars, you have to work in the federal government that amount of time. So let's say it's 4 years. And you're going to come work in the federal government, not at NSA or Department of Defense, but at the Department of Interior, at Social Security Administration, at DHS. And then after you fill that time and you go work in the private sector, that company is going to loan you back into the federal government for the proverbial 1 week in a month, one week in a month, 2 weeks a year, or likely it's going to probably be more something like 10 days a quarter or 10 days every other quarter to make sure that there's enough time that you can get your hands into a major problem. So what does this do? This allows cross-pollination of ideas between the private and the public sector. It allows for the private sector to understand some of the challenges and tribulations that we're having within the government, and it accepts the fact that the government is never going to be able to compete with the private sector for good talent. And so this is something, but guess what? Like with most things, it sounds real simple. The problem we have is, of those 15,000 positions in the federal government that are unfilled, we don't have common job descriptions for those. So if we have somebody graduating from, you name the university, and we don't know exactly if they're going to have the skill set to fill that job because we don't have a job description. This is something that wouldn't exist in the commercial sector. So we're trying to solve that problem. Not having a federal CIO encumbers that a little bit, but what has been great is the Office of American Innovation is an entity that we have been working with closely on the implementation of MGT, on the implementation of many of these other issues. I think cybersecurity is one of those final bastions of bipartisan support up here in Washington, D.C., and that's something under the past administration, both sides of the political divide worked very closely with. Tony Scott, the old federal CIO, and I probably talked almost weekly, and a lot of the work that has been done, we need to make sure we take advantage of and can continue on. Not having some of the permanent CIOs in positions across the agency has been difficult. It's 9 months. But Congress should continue to fulfill our oversight role and bring many of those folks back to the Hill and shine a light and make sure they're following up on many of the programs that were put in place under the past administration. And that's something that my subcommittee is really looking to do. So I just got the sign. I'm going to go ahead and wrap up there and love to take some questions and talk further about what y'all want to care about. Who's first? Yes, sir, in the back of the room.
Thank you, sir. Great comments. Some media reports this week about Russia regularly spoofing GPS signals, and given how dependent our networks are on GPS timing for their functioning, what should we do to secure our federal and other networks?
So the way you spoof a GPS sensor, it requires proximity, and with a very low level amount of energy, you can spoof it. And that's why our military has been developing systems that don't work on GPS. One of the other concerns that I have is space is a contested environment. It's contested just like land, air, and sea. And our capabilities and our advances in space are not that wide from our other competitors like Russia and China. This is going to further complicate the capabilities of spoofing some of the ground-based technology that we do have. That's why we have to continuously make sure that we're defending against counterintelligence threats to whatever technology that we may or may not have. So cyberspace is also a contested domain, just like air, land, sea, and space. And we have to. One of my problems there is we don't know what a digital act of war is. That's something I know CSIS, y'all have had many conversations. If the North Koreans launched a missile into Equifax headquarters, we all know how we would respond, right? But the theft of all their information, all of y'all's information, nobody in here opted in to a credit monitoring system. But that information is going to be ultimately used against us. It has shaken the foundations of authentication because we do so much authentication based on what you find in that credit report, and guess what? Now somebody has it. So they're going to be able to spoof you. Is that an act of war? Okay, let's say we can't figure out what an act of war. What should our response to some of these kinds of things be? Those are very valid questions, and sometimes the response should be articulated. Sometimes the response should be, I'm not going to tell you what we're going to do, but we're going to do something. Strategic ambiguity is valuable at times as well, but we should be having these conversations. The UN has identified what is an act of war. One of the things they say is an act of war is manipulating somebody's utility grid, fooling with the electricity. Guess what? That happened. The Russians did it to the Ukrainians. What was the response? Nada. Right? So these are some of the questions we should be having. And yes, these questions are being discussed in different places, but we don't have a national strategy around that. And so these are some of the issues that we're going to have to grapple with over the next few weeks and months. Who's next? I guess nobody cares about the Russians either, you know? Yeah, yes, sir.
Hey, thank you. Representative Hurd, appreciate all the work you've done on getting MGT across the finish line.
We're not going to spike the football yet. We still have a little way to go.
Jeremy Olcox with Clear Edge Partners.
Yeah.
Will there be a report card that will be developed to hold agencies accountable for the development or utilization of these funds?
Sure.
And the flexibilities?
The answer is yes, because we're going to add it to the FITARA scorecard. The FITARA scorecard, as I said, is something we look at, something as simple. The federal government is supposed to be consolidating their data centers. But every time GAO does a review, they find out, oh, we have some more data centers that we didn't keep track of before. It's like, how does that happen? And so we're grading things like that, and we're going to add the MGT fund, the working capital fund, to this, because in my opinion, if an agency is taking advantage of the working capital fund, then they have a culture of modernization within the organization, and that's a good thing. Now, we also, when we created this, there was no expectation that all 26 CFO agencies, that's the term for the large agencies in the federal government, we're going to take advantage of this. And that's okay. We wanted to have 26 different kind of laboratories. But over time, we should be able to see that. And one of my concerns is, in the first year of this, and let's say we get this done in December, when the NDAA, when we have a conference committee between the Senate and the House on the NDAA, and that gets signed by the President, we have until the end of the fiscal year. Right? And so we want to make sure that we are working with some agencies to ensure that they're taking advantage of this in year one. And the goal is to keep track of that on the FITARA scorecard. Because we're already doing other things like monitoring the Megabyte Act, making sure agencies know all the software licenses that they have. And guess what? The answer is they don't, right? Which is just absolutely shocking to me. One, it's a waste of money, and two, not knowing what tools you have on what widgets you have on your network is just unexcusable to me.
Hi, it's great to see you again. Karen
Yeah.
Evans from the U.S. Cyber Challenge. I want to follow up on the scorecard question. So is it, I know it is possible, so I know I'm planning this idea with you.
Yeah.
Okay, on data center consolidation, when GAO comes back, when I talk to agencies and I say, hey, how come you're just not eliminating a data center? The answer is we don't get graded on that. So they're only tracking consolidation. So can you come up like with a blue color on the scorecard that gives them points for innovation for total elimination of data centers versus consolidation? Because they're doing exactly what you ask them, and they're not like reaching to what you really want them to do.
So if they don't think they're getting graded on it, then I'd like to talk to that CIO. One of the concerns we've been hearing from them is that they thought they should be graded on the utilization of the space. And we said, great, good idea. Let's make that half the score. And the first time we did it, you know what happened? All the scores dropped because their utilization rates were terrible. And so what is often frustrating for me is how can some of this behavior continue? And for me, it's continued oversight, and we'll look at that issue specifically if it drives good behavior. I actually enjoy having boring hearings. Because if we have a boring hearing, that means whatever the issue we were going to look at, they sorted it out the night before, right? And that's what always happens. And so you come in and be like, why haven't you done this issue? Oh, Congressman, we took care of that yesterday morning. Great. But that's fine. That's where oversight goes. But we'll look into that and follow up. And you know Austin, so drop a line to Austin and Troy.
Okay.
I'm going to take my
Yes.
prerogative quickly
Yeah.
to ask you a follow-up question as well. You mentioned that you initially decided to run for Congress when you realized the lack of experience and sophistication in Congress on these issues. Do you think that's improved? And where do you see that going over the next few years?
So I'm in Kabul. Bomb goes off on the embassy, kills some of the local guard, takes out a section of the wall. My unit had to figure out what was going on. And later that night, we had a congressional delegation in the embassy in Kabul from members of the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence. And we get in the briefing, and a member asked, this is 2007, 2008, why was Iran not supporting the Taliban in Afghanistan? For an august body like here, y'all know how crummy of a question that is. So I started explaining the Sunni-Shia divide. Congressman raises his hand. He goes, Hurd, what's the difference between a Sunni and a Shia? And I'm thinking he's getting ready to make a really inappropriate joke, and who am I to deny him that opportunity? And my response was, I don't know, Congressman, what's the difference? And I'm waiting to go, ba-dum-bum-bum. His face goes bright red, didn't know that difference in Islam. Now, I don't expect my brother to know that, one sect thought Ali was the person that was supposed to succeed Prophet Muhammad, and the other group, believed Abu Bakr was the one ultimately ordained by God. I don't expect that, but you should know the macro issues on, Iran, Iraq, Lebanon, Syria. You should be able to understand some of these basic things. Many of my colleagues that deal with financial services issues don't know the difference between an investment bank, a credit union, and a commercial and a community bank. There are still colleagues of mine that believe the dark web is direct messaging on Twitter. But I will say, the focus on the issues of the day, people care about that, and I've found my colleagues to want to reach out and get smarter on. And that's why having engagement with industry, engagement with academia, engagement with nonprofits is so important to raising the common body of knowledge on whatever particular topic we may be dealing with. And I will say, when it comes to cybersecurity, OPM has focused everybody's attention on this topic and is making it something that folks want to care about. And I have been shocked. I just turned 40. I've only been in Congress for 2.5 years. I have been shocked at how more senior members of the House and the Senate have actually reached out on many of these issues to leverage my background and experience. So I'm hopeful that we continue to try to get smart on these issues. And the difficulty is, how do you let's use a recent example, the federal elections law that was written, I don't know exactly what year it was written, social media didn't exist. So when you were talking about the rules and laws that govern political advertisements, things were written out very specifically, and if you don't foresee future technology, then those laws don't recover. So we have to start changing our perspective on how can we regulate or legislate for outcomes versus specific tactics. And that takes, it's hard. It's hard to do. Yes, sir.
Hi, I'm Carter Brill. You mentioned CIOs. In talking about once the MGT Act does cross the goal line, how important will it be to have those CIO positions filled, or how does the Office of American Innovation sort of leverage their experience there to help implementation?
So Office of American Innovation, OMB, have been really good partners in working on making sure we implement this rule. And they're excited, they have ideas on how they already want to use it. And so whether you have a acting or a permanent CIO, to me, it ultimately doesn't matter, because we're going to continue to shine a light on this issue. And yes, there's probably some acting CIOs that want to say, oh, we're not going to do anything because somebody new is going to come in, they're going to have a different perspective. Well, after 9 months, guess what? We're going to still have you in front of the committee and say, why are you not following up on the plans that were given to you from the previous folks? And why are you not implementing some of the good policy that DHS is putting out? So that insight is going to continue. Yes, it'll be great to have some of these permanent CIOs, but we have to deal with realities on the ground. I know they're looking and trying to make it happen. In the back.
Patience Wade, FTI. There is a recognition at DHS that 70–80% of critical infrastructure in the United States actually falls within the private sector. How does that play out with cybersecurity when Equifax, for instance, demonstrates it's fine to talk about OPM, but there is a major private sector risk as well?
It's a very good question, and I think the conversation on breach standards is going to pick back up. I think the conversation on the way somebody was explaining to me today, we always talk about counterterrorism, but we should be talking about preventing terrorism, right? And we always talk about cybersecurity and responding to attacks, that we should talk about preventing attacks. And the way we're going to ultimately do that is to ensure cooperation between the federal and the private sectors, especially when it comes to critical infrastructure. And I think, look, our banks have probably a better idea of where the Russians are going to try to attack the financial infrastructure and then my friends in government. And so we should be able to take those assumptions and turn them into collection requirements and have the folks in the NSA and the CIA go and collect on that and turn that back, get that back in the hands of people that are having to defend this infrastructure. Turning private sector assumptions into national collection requirements is not difficult. Tasking that out to core collectors isn't hard. But once that information is received, getting it back into the hands of folks in the private sector, that's the difficult thing to do when we're trying to figure out how we're going to do it. But when it comes specifically to Equifax, I always said that if a private sector company would have done what OPM had done, there would be tens of millions of dollars of fines and people thrown in jail. So we're going to see how this unfolds as regulators start looking at this, and I don't know the answer. Yes, sir.
Congressman Scott Townsend with DHS and Canadian IDs.
Right back at you.
I think back to all the technical and the things and the changing things you're talking about. I think back to the 9/11 Commission basically telling us we organizationally were not ready to handle the surprise.
Yep.
How do we avoid continuously being surprised? And it's not just cyber, it's all the other stuff that'll
Sure.
keep coming down the track. And I just can't see where we're culturally more able to push and adapt and just not keep waiting for the next thing to hit us.
So the 9/11 Commission made it very clear that the intelligence community had to shift from a culture of need to know to need to share. And I have been surprised at how intelligence sharing within the federal government has improved from 2001 to from 9/11 to when I left the CIA in August 2009. And I've even been even more shocked at how it's improved from when I left to getting in Congress. And I would call that horizontal sharing across the federal government. But the same concepts are important in cybersecurity and information sharing when it comes to cybersecurity. That's why I think it's so important that DHS, is the belly button of information sharing between the federal government and the private sector, because I think DHS is the only entity that really has the culture that can get to need to share. And the example I use, I think I used this morning. I've been out of the CIA since 2009. I've never said the true name of the farm, even though it's in every book and every movie, right? It's just, that's the culture that I've come from. So DHS is so important because I think they have the culture to do that. Many people want to criticize what was the report? I'm blanking on the name. When the the utility in Vermont was hit, and there was a DHS report that came out, and Aurora. There were some technical. It could have been a little bit tighter from a technical perspective, but the fact that it was being shared as quickly as it was is a sign of where we see that culture trying to go. So we should be encouraging more of that. But look, the defenders always have to be right. The attackers only have to be right once. That's the reality. You also have, when it comes to cybersecurity, the ongoing tension, what I call the intelligence challenge. You have intelligence, and you can do an action based on that intelligence, but the action on that intelligence could make you lose the ongoing intelligence. Right? So that's the dilemma that you always have. That's why I think it's important that it's policymakers that make the decision on whether to action or not action. And I think if you use an example of NSA and Cyber Command being ultimately split eventually, NSA, intelligence organization, is always going to say we shouldn't do anything that could potentially impact our sources. Cyber Command's going to say no, we got to action. It should not be NSA or Cyber Command's decision to do that. It should ultimately be the National Security Council in the White House to make that decision. So you take it out of the hands of the operator to do that. And so this is a tension that has been around. What I would say, intelligence is the second oldest profession. Is that right? So it's been around since then. And it requires us to recognize the fact that we work together. Keith Alexander always says, former head of the NSA, he says, if the private sector thinks they can defend their infrastructure alone and the government can defend its infrastructure alone, it's the equivalent of the French believing the Maginot Line can protect them from the Germans. And that's why we're in this together, and we can work together, and then we start integrating our allies as well. So I think I got the high sign. So thank you all to CSIS for inviting me, and thank you all for being here today.
All right, so please join me in welcoming our distinguished panel to the stage now. This is a great group of some of the real leading experts on these issues, so looking forward to hearing from them.
I guess I'll see you, Dan. That's my problem.
So we've all heard a lot of really interesting insights from both Assistant Secretary Manfra and Representative Hurd about some of the issues that we're talking about today, but we are very lucky to have 4 of the leading experts on these issues on the stage today. Representative Hurd mentioned the $90 billion that the federal government spends on IT, and the people that we have up here have spent that money, they've received that money, and they've thought about how it should be spent better. So we really have quite a wide range of perspectives, and they know these issues inside and out. I'm going to introduce them each briefly, and then I think we'll start by getting their reactions to some of what we just heard. But to start, Christian Marone is the Senior Vice President for External Relations and Chief of Staff at CSRA. He is also one of the people with the rare distinction of having served in senior presidential positions in multiple administrations under both Republicans and Democrats. He's really a true expert on these issues and someone who is able to work across the political lines to get the job done. Dan Chinock is the Executive Director of the Center for the Business of Government at IBM. Dan has been one of the leading thinkers on these issues for a long time. I won't say quite how long, and for Dan's sake, but he was previously in a past life a main leader at OMB, looking at how the federal government uses information and technology, and is really one of the leading experts on the issues of government policy for acquiring and utilizing these technologies. Dan was also, to put in a plug here, a member of our CSIS task force for the 45th president, which provided a very detailed report on how we can deal with a full range of cyber issues. And he actually served on that commission with Karen Evans.
And the 44th president.
That's true. And Dan was on our previous commission as well for the 44th president. So that gives you a little sense of dates here. But he and Karen is currently the director of the U.S. Cyber Challenge. And she is also a former senior official at OMB, where she was director for, was it information technology?
I was the administrator for eGov and IT, which is now called the federal CIO job.
Yes. So obviously one of the real leading people who has been at the very top of the government's policies on these issues and figuring out how to manage the millions of systems across the government, all of the legacy systems, and to deal with all of the challenges that have been presented as technology has evolved. Finally, we have Jim Williams, and we're very grateful to Jim for coming today. Jim has a great perspective on these issues after having served as the acting administrator of the General Services Administration. And for those of you who are steeped in federal acquisitions, I'm sure you are familiar with them. For the rest of you, GSA plays a really leading role in actually helping the government to acquire, deploy, and make use of these technologies. He's really familiar with the challenges that arise even when you have the will, you have the policy, you have the authorities to do some of these things. The challenges of working through that government process are really something that Jim has dealt with on the front lines. So we have a phenomenal panel today. I think they'll be extremely insightful on these issues, but I'm going to open it up first to reactions from each of you to what you heard from Representative Hurd and also from Assistant Secretary Manfra, and maybe we'll just go across, starting with Christian.
Sure. Thank you for having us. I used to always be the youngest person in the room, but now seeing Jeanette, who used to work for me, feeling a little old. I'm proud of the work that she's doing at DHS. I'm proud of the work that DHS is doing. They've come a long way in a short period of time to really up their game. What struck me are a couple things. One, the IT modernization bill is foundational. It's kind of table stakes in my view. And I think it's great that it's getting close to the finish line. We're not there yet, but it'll really help. But I think Congressman Hurd really hit on two major issues that I think are really kind of seminal issues. First is we have to modernize our IT infrastructure. It's just critical, so we shouldn't be waiting just for an IT modernization bill to pass. So we're seeing that across the federal government in bits and pieces here and there. But really, that's where the vulnerabilities come from, is when you're trying to defend, cobalt systems like at OPM, it does become very challenging. And after a while, you're just spending bad money after bad money. That was the first thing. I think the second thing is really, from my perspective, being at DoD and then at DHS and being in senior positions at both, the CIOs are just critical. And every CIO is different, sits differently in their organizations, and that all really needs to be reckoned with. If we're expecting departments and agencies across the federal government really to modernize and take their infrastructure to the places where we expect it, they need to have a seat at the table with their secretaries, with their deputies, and I can tell you from firsthand experience that doesn't happen. It's too uneven across the federal space. But these are the people, when something happens, everyone wants to turn to and point the finger at. But when it comes to budget time, when you're developing your budget and all, they're often the folks that you don't really hear from and you need to hear from. And so, big champion of really pushing those folks further up in the leadership stack, if you will, because they need to have the visibility of the seniors. They need to be sharing kind of the issues that they're experiencing and their vision in terms of where they're going to take the IT, especially since the cabinet secretaries and the department heads are going to be held accountable both by the White House and as you heard Congressman Hurd, they continue to be held accountable by Congress. And I'll just say the last thing is on cyber training. So the federal government's never going to compete with the private sector for the workforce. Some aspects of the government are not going to compete with others. It's going to be really difficult, and it continues to be difficult for places like DHS to compete for talent against, say, NSA. I think the Department of Defense is a real center of excellence in terms of the training that they are able to provide. So taking folks who are in other career civilian roles and be able to train them in cybersecurity. DoD has some really neat programs which they train folks. And so especially as we're talking about this Cyber National Guard, which I think is a great idea, the tools are there and they need to be not just in the DoD realm, but we need to spread those across the federal space and make them available to everybody. So I said two, but those are the kind of three things that struck me just off the top.
Thanks, Will. It's great to be here on this terrific panel. I look forward to our discussion. Interesting remarks up from DHS and from Congressman Hurd. Some common themes I heard in addition to modernization were information sharing in an operational sense. It's good to share. It's better to be able to act after the information is shared to stop the threat or plug the vulnerability. And then also to act with agility. I think one of the questions are about how do you get the government to kind of act quickly. It's a big government. There are many players. And so two of the thoughts that I had were, how do you actually implement these objectives around modernization and sharing at an operational scale and agility? And two thoughts just given sort of the reality of the fact that we're always going to have multiple centers of gravity in government, in DHS and in the White House and the intelligence community and the agencies, CIOs, program leaders, is to think about governance as one of the first principles, sort of governance for technology, governance for cyber, making sure that people know clearly and quickly how their roles and responsibilities fit together so that when an incident occurs or an exercise happens, people know sort of what part of the field they go to immediately. It's one of the things our commission report talked about last year, and it's critically important as I've watched over the years. Successes occur, it's often when governance is done well, and when governments had challenges, it's often because people kind of don't know how to work with one another. So that's sort of within the government. And then, of course, there was the discussion around reliance on the private sector and the infrastructure there. And there, I think it's more a question of incentives and aligning incentives from government to industry, both in terms of the strategies, like the national strategies that were put out in both this administration and the previous administration, as well as the modernization plan, as well as the execution of those strategies in things like procurement documents. Because as those of us that have worked in the private sector understand, we're going to basically do what the procurement documents require us to do. And if those documents don't really align to the strategy, then there's a disconnect between the delivery of technology in a secure manner and the goals that are set by the government. So drawing that line, creating those incentives for government program leaders to work through the acquisition system and for the private sector to deliver capabilities that meet those objectives is critically important. And again, when government's working well, that connection gets made very well. Our procurement system, as many of us know, as Jim knows better than just about anybody I've ever met, it takes a lot to get to that, what sounds like a fairly simple, straightforward objective, but it's really something that can't be forgotten.
Okay.
Karen?
Well, Will gave us this assignment, so of course I'm an overachiever, and here are all my notes. And what I've done is I've X'd out, so I won't be redundant, the things that my esteemed colleagues have said. And I apologize, don't worry, I am not contagious. And so yeah, because my voice is horrible. So what I really wanted to hit on, there were some key points that Jeanette had hit on. And I think this is right, and she said she was excited, and I'm excited too, because we're in another transitional phase. And she said going from technical to risk management, and that's a key function that I think all of us need to really think about, because this conversation always devolves into a technical type of conversation. So she said they're really trying to do that, to move from technical to risk management, from compliance to monitoring, so that it feeds into the risk management, moving from policy to operational, truly operational. And then the last piece that she talked about, which of course obviously I'm all 100% for based on our papers, is shared services and how you actually make shared services operational for both the federal government as well as private sector. As far as Congressman Hurd, of course, my number one thing would be talent, and talent on multiple places, and the net guard and what he's talked about there. But the one concept I think we don't want to lose is always looking ahead. So I was glad that he talked about quantum computing and AI, because that's what we really need to look at, because we're still putting models together under the old way. And the way that I mean that is, in Washington, D.C., we look from the inside out. And on a lot of these now, we're going to have to look from the outside in. And that's a lot of what he was talking about. If you talk about endpoints or whatever, it's outside in, and then how do you protect that? And that's a change in the dynamic. The other piece that he talked about, which really got me excited, was Congress itself trying to change and legislate for outcomes versus tactics. If Congress can pull off legislating for outcomes versus tactics, I think all of us will be really excited, especially those who have to implement. And then the last piece, which made me very hopeful, is the DHS's culture that he talked about and embraced, and their culture of need to share. And I think we really, as a nation, need to build off of that culture that DHS is growing.
Well, good afternoon, and thank you to CSIS for having this important forum. Listening to Congressman Hurd talking about intelligence being the second oldest profession, over 3 decades ago, when I was offered a job in procurement, I didn't know what it meant, so I looked it up in the dictionary, and it meant to obtain prostitutes. So I think that means procurement is the oldest profession. And if you have any problem in government, any bureaucracy, whether it's cyber or anything else, it's always safe to blame procurement, and procurement gets blamed for a lot of this. I guess one of the things that I heard from Congressman Hurd that I thought was most important is we need a national strategy. And I look at this as having a system, and a system is always composed of people, policy, process, technologies. And when you look at this in the context of right now we're dealing with hurricanes, and think about the DHS mission of detect and protect, response, and recover. In a way, those 4 things apply to cyber: detect, prevent, response, and recover. And then if you're going to build a system under each one of those, and a system around that, that is comprised of people, of process, of policy, composed of research, information sharing, and how do you act under all of those different things, and how do you bring that together in a national strategy in a tightly coupled system. Whereas Dan said, going from a policy all the way into operational execution, which includes acquisition, I don't think we're there yet. And if you thought, when I think about things in government, what would you have built this system to look like if you were building it on the first day of the Republic? You know, and I think we need that vision for what we want this ability to deal with cybersecurity, what it looks like, comprised of those different elements, and then start to bring it together. Thinking about Assistant Secretary Manfra, I was surprised at some of the things she did not talk about. I thought it was great. She talked about enterprise risk management. She didn't talk about information sharing with our allies, and I think we have a very international audience. This is something that is not a United States only problem. It's a problem around the world. Really didn't mention the partnership with Department of Defense. And I know they're talking about within DHS changing the Undersecretary for NPPD to be the Undersecretary for Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Protection, or something with cyber in it. And I think that is very important, as she said. But I would ask you, who is the head of cybersecurity for the US government today? Who's the architect of that system? I honestly don't know. And I think somewhere, I've always believed problems are solved by leaders and people. And I think we need a cybersecurity czar again that brings together the abilities of DoD, DHS, the private sector, working with our allies to build those systems to be able to detect, protect, response, and recover. And we need to look at the acquisition system. If you look at the National Defense Authorization Act, there's a lot of talk about the great work being done in parts of DoD around cybersecurity because they have all these great authorities to do things differently. Every agency needs those authorities. So I think we need to train the cyber acquisition workforce. We need to link them into this tightly coupled system so that they have the authority to act very, very quickly. So I think we're all moving in the right direction, the enterprise risk management, but I think we're lacking a national strategy and tightly coupling all these things together.
Thank you, guys. So I want to backtrack just a little bit, and starting with Dan and Karen, you guys both served on our commission, as I mentioned, for the 45th president. And for those of you who aren't familiar with it, this was a group of really the leading experts across a range of cybersecurity issues, Dan and Karen being among them. And they provided recommendations before the election for whoever was president, what needed to be done, not from a political perspective, but from a operational perspective, from a providing true security outcomes perspective. And Dan and Karen were both involved in the section of that report that dealt with the federal government's cybersecurity, with modernizing federal government IT. So I wonder if the two of you can tell us a little bit about the recommendations that you guys put forward in that report, and then both based on what Undersecretary Manfra and Mr. Hurd said today, and also on the President's EO and on your own conversations with folks in government and around town, what is the current status of those efforts? What is the new administration doing, and where is there room to do more, and what's going really well?
You want to go first?
You were the chair.
Okay. All right. So here's my book. This is the report. If you don't have the chance, if you have the chance to read it.
This is the skinny version?
And that's the skinny version. This is the full version.
It's available on the CSIS website.
And the reason why I want to go over it quickly is because the skinny version, if you like the skinny version, it has all the recommendations in it and categorized, okay? But if you actually start reading through it, there's over like 120 different recommendations associated with the report. And we took the approach that it had to be actionable. So we didn't want pie in the sky, this is the kind of stuff. It was like, no matter who gets elected, what are they going to have to do in order to be able to hit the ground running and address the issues facing the nation? And that was the lens of how we put together the report. And so we also had East Coast, so I chaired East Coast, and Senator Whitehouse and Chairman McCall were also our co-chairs. And we had West Coast, because now the way, when you look at this, what the West Coast and Silicon Valley, and we can say Austin, Texas, and all the innovators and everybody who's inventing technology, their issues in this domain are different than policy people within Washington, D.C. So if you read Dan, the version that Dan has, you'll probably want to go and read this version, because what we did was release all the working papers, because one of the challenges was trying to reconcile what the West Coast was talking about, what they needed, versus what the East Coast was talking about, what they needed. So there was more of a private sector view for the West Coast types of recommendations versus the East Coast. So I want to give that part of it first. The other thing is that we did have the opportunity as a task force to brief both transition teams about the recommendations that were in here, so that they both had working knowledge of where the group was. So in short, based on the specific topics that we were talking about today, there are very specific recommendations that deal around shared services, procurement, and workforce issues, DHS itself, organizations with DHS. So actually our recommendation is for it to become an agency unto itself, an operational agency within DHS. There was a lot of legislation that Chairman McCall was sponsoring at the time, and so we did a deep dive and analysis of what it would take to do that, and some of the recommendations and some of the functions that should stay there versus some that should move out. So that it's very specific about that. Around shared services, which is a lot of what we've talked about today, the paper really focuses more on you should do shared services not for cost efficiencies, not for effectiveness of the federal government, but that shared services really need to be done from an aspect of national security. Because the agencies are collecting information, so how do you put protection around that, and then how do you maximize then that protection so that it has the greatest depth into all the federal agencies? And so it's changing that dynamic, and if you do the architecture around that type of approach, then the cost actually then would drop down. You know, you would get greater efficiencies, but it's looking at it through the lens of national security, not because it's cost effective, you know, and efficient. So that was the biggest change that we said about shared services. And then as far as workforce, and then I'll leave some for Dan. We talked about this concept not only of the net guard, which Congressman Hurd has embraced, but we've also talked about the need for cyber acumen, because the big thing that you're hearing throughout the conversations that we're having, it doesn't matter whether it's here or any other forum that you go, is that there's a culture change that needs to happen, both within private sector and within the agencies. And so it's manifesting itself in discussions that Christian had about where does the CIO sit, and they need a seat at the table. It's manifesting itself in Equifax around regulations, and now the CEO's gone, and the CIO left first, and so did the CISO. But it's like kind of going around the edges versus really saying that no matter what level of job you're in, there's a certain amount of cyber acumen that you need to have. There's a certain amount of awareness. And this is moving away from the annual, we need to do cybersecurity training that's in the Federal Information Security Now Modernization Act, into it needs to be thought about in everything I do, no matter what kind of business I take on, what kind of new system I want. I need to think about that. Or if I'm a secretary asking for a #1 priority, they had a little bit more of cyber acumen, they would realize, oh, it takes information technology, oh, there's a legal aspect, there's this. And so they have the business acumen. So now what we need to do is kind of mature the whole concept of cyber acumen, because going forward, there isn't anything that you're going to do from now on that isn't going to involve some type of IT. So people need to realize what's the risk associated with using it.
Very comprehensive.
Oh, good.
Absolutely.
Not that I have it memorized.
I'll just to pick up a few things. So part of the reason for acumen is it makes the job of cyber experts easier if there's a level of cyber acumen that reduces the attack footprint. If we have fewer vulnerabilities, because most of us who are not the cyber world, my children, my parents, are actually practicing cyber more effectively at home and at work, it allows the cyber experts to spend their time focusing on advanced threats. Because right now they're focusing a lot on things that are caused by more basic problems. And so there's a relationship between, and we talked about, between basic hygiene and the ability to devote scarce cyber resources to those advanced threats that you heard Assistant Secretary Moffitt talk about, Congressman Hurd talk about, in terms of focusing analytics on sort of where's that threat, how do we detect and respond to things that are moving through the net at lightning speed. So these things are interrelated. Another thing that the report talked about along this line, and Karen was a champion for this idea, is to establish a common baseline across the government. Those of you that have memorized the Computer Security Act, everybody who's memorized it, raise your hand. Okay. It's basically, ever since 1987, the law has been premised on this risk-based standard. And the risk-based standard is decided on by a program official who sits in an agency. The NIST guidance that implements that standard basically enables the agency to make that decision regardless of how high or low to set that level. And given the interdependence of the agencies in an internet world that's enabled through identification and authentication, you heard Congressman Hurd talk about that, where information can travel across civilian networks overseas, et cetera. We need, creating a baseline, a common baseline that takes into account what are the 10 or 15 things that if you do these right, you can reduce risk by maybe 60 or 70%. And basically requiring that in the configurations and the practices that agencies do. So the report talked about this as another element of it. And then I'll just close. One of the topics that we haven't really talked about today is the topic of data protection and privacy. And I was one of the leads on that section. I also chair a DHS advisory committee that talks about the intersection of security and privacy. Currently, we work with NPPD and the privacy office there. And the report talked about the need to kind of think about privacy and security together as a data protection strategy. You heard Congressman Hurd, I think, talk about data breach response legislation and reconciling that. The report actually made a recommendation in those areas. So trying to think about how do we establish this baseline, how do we protect individuals, and then how do we then, by doing so, enable cyber professionals and cyber experts to really focus on the threats that they need to do, given the limited resources and bandwidth that they have. Those were some of the sort of strands that the report went through. And I'll just close. One of the questions you asked is sort of how's that manifesting in the current environment, and I think there are elements of all of these recommendations in the executive order and in the modernization plan.
Well, and the one last piece, and I agree, the executive order took to heart a lot of the recommendations that are in here dealing with the agency head. But there's one piece, if you only read the short version, that you can take away. And Jim, you hit on it about our allies and information sharing dealing with our allies. So what was really important to Chairman McCall as well as to Senator Whitehouse was the whole idea of the data flows and the national strategy and how you would do that and how we need to have MLATs reform going forward. So a key concept in this was that if the administration could agree to a principle while all the other pieces are working out, the principle that we set forward is data, and it's along the lines of the privacy piece, is data belongs to the user. Which means if the country, so for example, you guys here for the United States or wherever country you're representing, if the data belongs to you, then your country can now figure out what's the agreement, what kind of technical structure you need to have around that, how do you do the privacy, and then it'll roll up into then how do we do data flows between countries, how do we protect that, and then how do we deal with that from a law enforcement intelligence perspective. So the paper did very specifically say if the administration could adopt that principle that data belongs to the user, it would set forth a lot of clarity while all these other pieces are going forward.
Thank you, guys. So I want to turn to Christian now. As someone who is trying to provide a lot of these solutions to the government, there was a lot of talk today about the fact that the private sector is ahead and we need to think about bringing what the private sector has into the government and streamlining that transition. and the transformation that's happened where a lot of the digital technologies that we use today were born in the federal government, but they've really grown up in the private sector. So as one of the key bridges that brings those technologies into the government, and having sat in the government trying to get access to these technologies, how do you think that's going? And what's your wish list in terms of what can we do next to improve that process?
Well, let me start by, I'm very pragmatic in the way I look at these things. So having been in the government, when you're dealing with problems, you don't have the luxury of kind of being very theoretical. So you're just looking for practical solutions. I think the biggest impediment we have right now to really upping the game in terms of technology in the federal side, I mentioned the CIO issue. That's not insignificant. I do think that's a big issue. But Jim hit on it and hit the nail on the head. Is the way we buy things today is antiquated. So we buy a lot of things. It's more geared around a system, like a weapon system, something tangible, something that we're accustomed, we feel comfortable buying a truck or some goods. We don't know how to buy technology. When I say that is, in the private sector, the move has been outcome-based delivery. You want to buy an outcome. When you go on your Uber app, you don't care how Uber gets that car to you, whatever. You click on that app, where you want to go, that service comes to you, and then you pay that fee. You want that outcome, and it's up to Uber to figure out how the driver gets paid and whatnot. That's where the private sector has moved towards, and that's where we're seeing the federal government really struggle, is really how do you buy those outcomes? Because a lot of times, to be fair, they don't even understand what their outcomes what they really want. So what do we devolve to? We devolve to a staff augmentation, butts and seats kind of stuff. We hold on to more of the legacy IT. We're a bit squeamish about some of this new emerging technology that we're seeing that really can help automate. At the end of the day, technology is not the end-all, be-all. Technology is there to enhance the ability of decision makers to make decisions more quickly, more efficiently. But we're handicapping ourselves because we don't understand how we can buy those types of things in a more rapid fashion. And certainly, instead of buying a system, where we want to buy an outcome. And I think that's where certainly we see things moving. That's the future, and we need to train our acquisition workforce to kind of get there, because otherwise we're going to just be continuing to do the same thing over and over. And I think it's no secret that no matter if we have an IT modernization fund, or even if we raise the level of the CIOs, we're still going to struggle with how we actually physically procure it, because the CIO at the end of the day is not the one that buys at his contract shop. His acquisition folks are the ones that are doing that nitty-gritty type of work. And so I think we have a lot of work there still to be done across the federal space. So that to me is really kind of the difference between what we see on the commercial side and what we see in the government side.
So Jim, maybe you want to take a stab at answering Christian's question, how do we buy those outcomes? And if you were sitting at GSA today, what do you think that are the next steps that can be taken to do that?
Well, first, I think Christian is right on. The speed of change of the threats and the speed of change of the solutions, we're not keeping up with either, with the acquisition system. And what do you need then to keep up with that speed? I think he's right. You need a better trained workforce. You also probably need to give them the same broad authorities that you're giving to pockets of Department of Defense, like DIUX, which they take all the rules away from them so they can do things faster. But we don't have that same broad set of authorities across the rest of the government. And when I think of a breach, and everybody's putting all the eggs in the basket of the CIO, I don't, because you look at a place like GSA or Interior. So there's a breach, and does the CIO really get involved in all the vehicles? Does it get involved in all the building systems? So I think you need a broad capability for the acquisition people to work with whoever that customer is, because information technology is in all parts of the mission. Give them the authority to move quickly and get the people trained, because typically procurement and acquisition people, they don't think about speed. They think about process. And what Christian said about weapon systems, the DoD 5000 series of processes is a very long string of processes. We don't have the time for that. And if DHS issues a binding operational directive that says to the agencies, here's a threat, do something. And sometimes that threat has to be accomplished by doing something through contracting. We need people who are light on their feet, know how to take advantage of the authorities, work well with the contractors. And I think what we want from the contractor community is we want innovation. And I don't believe innovation only comes from Silicon Valley. It comes from large companies, small companies, all over, from academia. We want innovation, but we also want compliance. So we want to pull the best from, and where we see the solution, we want to implement that solution quickly. And I think everything Christian said is what we need. We need a better trained workforce, light on their feet, with the right authorities, and know how to work together where there's some kind of knowledge sharing system so they figure out, as DHS puts out a binding operational directive, did it work? Well, did one agency do it better? And you really need the, what they call the hot wash. You look at, did we do this well? How do we do it better? Did somebody in the states do it well? And how do they pass that on to the federal agencies?
One of the things, that just on that note, just to give you an example, so when we lived through the OPM breach and being there having a seat at the table, watching this unfold, we quickly realized that every contract vehicle we had, that we were going to procure anything where our folks, our personal information was going to be transferred in some form or another or be exposed. Every one of those contracts needed to have a cybersecurity clause in there, because when we looked at the USIS contract, USIS was the contractor, there was nothing about the standards that they had to maintain for their system. And when we actually went in their system, it was kind of nightmarish in terms of what it actually looked like, and it's kind of underscores why it happened. So we quickly moved at the department to put, at least in our contracts, every one of our contracts moving forward, we wanted to have a clause in there about cybersecurity. There were certain standards every single contractor had to have around cybersecurity. It took us over a year to get that into contracts. Now, OPM at the time, and I still think, is kind of one of the biggest seminal events in our country in terms of cybersecurity breaches. I don't know how many people in here got the notice. I got it 3 times. My wife did, that my information was taken. It probably was taken from Home Depot or somewhere else anyway. But the fact of the matter is, this was such a big event, and we could not get our procurement acquisition folks to turn that quick enough. And it took over a year. And that's just one example of the frustration that I had sitting in the front office of the Department of Homeland Security trying to make some of these changes quickly. It underscores the challenges that we have, I think, in the contract acquisition procurement realm.
One other thing I'd add, some of you may remember that there was also a commission last year that was chartered from the White House. And they were asking these kinds of questions, operational questions. Karen and I actually testified together at one of their hearings. And one of the subjects was, to Kristen and Jim's point, how do you really get innovation in cyber? And one of the discussions we talked about was use the acquisition system. Right now, acquisition for technology is like one big life cycle blob. And it sort of starts at the beginning and goes through a long process, and then you get to a result sometime later. As opposed to kind of creating an innovation seedbed where you can test out new ideas and then select prototypes and then pretty seamlessly scale them up. You have to start a whole new procurement process right now if you want to scale them up in a different vehicle, or it's hard to actually test multiple approaches from multiple vendors in the same vehicle. So we talked about different ways of thinking about thinking of the procurement as a series of steps in a commercial model where you would, let's say, get some ideas, test out pilots, test out prototypes. Some of the work that GSA has been piloting around agile procurement gets to this. And sort of thinking about this in a cyber realm and bringing in cyber innovation is something that we thought was important as well.
Well, and I'd like to add on kudos to Jim during his tenure, and also to his point about training, because to your point, what you just highlighted is the fact that the OPM procurement people are not following the FAR, okay? Because during my tenure, all of this stuff was released as part of the FAR. GSA did it as standard contract clauses that had to go in, that actually reference all the way back to the NIST checklist that actually have all of this stuff in there, because contractors under FSMA are required to follow the same rules and policies and standards that the agency itself is. So you just highlighted with a true life example of, okay, the procurement people at OPM did not follow the rules, so they need more training, and therefore, because they didn't follow the rules, you saw the whole cascading effect associated with that. So it's really understanding how all these pieces work. All the foundational pieces are there now. It's bringing it together, like you said, and then making sure that people know what they're supposed to be doing, because it's now critical. It's coming to you 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And so we've had the luxury in the past, although it didn't seem like it then, to build this foundational work that you didn't have to always change the FAR, that NIST just has to change a checklist, okay? But somebody's got to stay on it, and then somebody has to make sure that contracting is putting that in there, and then that the CIO is educated enough, has the skill sets, has the staff, that then is enforcing the terms and conditions of the contract. And so, you know, that also has to all be taken into consideration going forward.
And this is why we need Karen back in government.
Just so fun.
Yeah. Well, fingers crossed on that. So I want to just round out here. There have been a lot of, I think, pretty disappointing things said today. You know, the federal government will never compete for talent. Certain agencies in the government won't be able to compete among the talent pool we can get. We don't know how to buy IT. Is there any silver lining to all of this? Is there any positive thing that you would say? And having all four been involved in many of the efforts over the last years to fix these problems, do you think that we're moving in a positive direction, and are you optimistic about where we're going?
I'm optimistic. I'm a Philadelphian, so I'm naturally more pessimistic than most folks. So I'm very optimistic about where things are going. I think having someone finally in Congress who understands and can spell IT is always great. Congressman Hurd's been a breath of fresh air in terms of his tenacity pushing these things. I think a lot of great work has been done in the previous administration and is being carried through in this administration. The American Innovation Council, I think, ultimately want to see all these things put into practice. So we'll wait to see that, but I think a lot of good work has already been done. I got to say, not just because I feel a bit of ownership from it, but I think DHS has dramatically improved its cyber capabilities. When I started, when cyber really became, are you okay?
Sorry.
When cyber really started to kind of come about in 2008, where it started to come to the forefront, Secretary Gates with General Alexander, we decided to stand up Cybercom. And I remember at that time, DHS was just really kind of getting into cybersecurity as well, although it wasn't one of their primary missions. And it was like pulling teeth, really, to get DHS to come aboard and to work together with them. Fast forward to my 2+ years at DHS, having witnessed the level of cooperation that they have established with DOD, NSA, FBI. Granted, is there still more work to go? Absolutely. Those bonds can never, they always need improvement, but the technical capability, the workforce has dramatically improved. And so, from that standpoint, I'm very pleased. And I think, obviously DOD has made tremendous strides, and we're starting to see, obviously, a lot more awareness across the federal space and adoption of some of these newer technologies, next-gen technology, which ultimately will help departments and agencies be more secure. So there's a lot to be optimistic about, no doubt. I think there are still a lot of foundational things, I think, as you hear us talking, that really still need to be overcome and really be dealt with. They're not sexy things. They're not things that are going to be on 60 Minutes or get people's attention. Certainly, but they're the things that need to be done. As I said, they're table stakes kind of things.
Yeah, what's the famous GAO line? Progress made, more work to do. I think that if I think back to 20 years ago, when we at OMB were going around talking to the agencies about computer security, before the cloud existed, and it was a very difficult conversation because they kind of just didn't think about that unless they were a real technical staff person. And now you've got, in the public and private sectors, understanding across the C-suite about the importance of this, some because it really has been a problem in their organization, and some because they realize that cybersecurity is actually a strong enabler of mission success across the government in everything that we do. We can't order an Uber without confidence that the cyber network of that order is going to be maintained. So I'm very hopeful as a long-term proposition that there are great people in the government across at the career levels in agencies. There's been bipartisan support across multiple administrations for improvements, and they've carried forward. And the fact that you're seeing now in the modernization plan a lot of tenets around cybersecurity and shared services and cloud that were advanced in the previous administrations is a sign that it takes a long time for the government to move, but it's moving in a direction that while the sine curve may go up and down, and we've been talking today about a lot of the challenges of that sine curve, the slope of the curve kind of is gradually going up. And that's where I think that we all can work together over the course of the next year to make sure that we try to minimize the problems that are manifest that exhibit in that sine curve, and hopefully slowly raise that slope so we're seeing faster progress.
Well, I will say that when Karen was in government, she was healthy. So she just needs to come back in. I guess I'm optimistic too, but it does feel like we're losing. When you hear numbers of like the OPM breach, Equifax 143 million, it doesn't feel like we're winning. It is comforting to see people like Congressman Hurd, who has leadership and the intellect and the passion to do something about this. To see leaders like Assistant Secretary Manfra, who's looking at this from the enterprise risk management. I'm an original plank holder at DHS. I will tell you, when we started, when you talk about sharing, we stole toner from each other to get the job done. So I think that has remarkably changed across the government and within DHS and across the world, the sharing of information. But I do think we have a long ways to go. I think of part of what we're supposed to do for the American people, life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. People are living in fear that either their identity will be stolen, national security systems will be compromised. I think we have a whole lot of work to do. And I think doing this more from that enterprise risk management, getting the right people, the right leaders in place, the right architect of a national strategy is critically important. And the private sector's going to chief risk officers who look at this not just a technology problem. When you think about what Secretary Manfra was talking about, continuous monitoring of technology, now we have to do continuous monitoring of people to make sure we understand insider threats and what could be a threat. And I think we need to bring all of that together. The physical, the personnel, the technology, security, all of that needs to come together. We've got a lot of work to do.
I'm healthy.
Okay.
I appreciate your all's patience. Okay, so my last piece is I agree with all of you guys, but I want to hit on one piece that you said, which is about leadership. And so it's all gonna, it doesn't matter whatever we all talk about at this level. I have a cough drop. That's what I went and got. Is that it's going to come down to leadership, and it's going to be the leadership of this administration that is going to make a difference going forward. So I think a lot of the old paradigms of what we've seen, I am very hopeful that this administration is not bound to that. And so if we want to make a change, this is this to me personally, this is Karen Evans speaking, is that this is the administration that's going to make it happen. So it's going to come down to the leadership from the White House and leadership all the way through to each and every part of the department as the agency heads go forward, because they know they're responsible. And by knowing that you're responsible and being held accountable, then you're going to start looking at the rest of the organization. So I agree with you 100%. It's leadership and people. And if they have the right priorities, then we'll be able to accomplish the things that we're talking about today.
All right, so I wanted to open it up to the floor for questions. Get them in here before we lose any panelists. Start at the back there.
Hi there, guys. Sam Baines. Everyone who spoke today, from the two speakers through to the entire panel, mentioned as one of the core problems as being lack of access to the people to do the job. Putting aside the fact that a lot of the major talent coming out of universities gets poached by the private sector, is the actual talent coming out of the universities good enough? Is the courses they're teaching correct? Or once they enter into government, do they then need to be retrained in what the government's actually doing? And if that is the case, what is the problem or disconnect there?
Okay, so this is in our working paper related to workforce. So, and this is a lot of what the U.S. Cyber Challenge is about, right? Is that there is a disconnect between what is being taught in school and the skills that are needed today. So part of what the working group did was also look at there's an immediate need, right? That's the 15,000 that was being talked about. There's a midterm and then there's a long-term need. So some of the people on the task force are actually working on the long-term accreditation, the curriculum, those types of things that have to evolve in the school system. And then there are specific things where there are several initiatives underway right now where people can demonstrate through competitions and other means that they have the capability, so that you can then take the capability. So some of the tools that Christian was talking about that DoD has is, for example, DoD builds a cyber range. They have a cyber range live. Okay, several of the states are now doing this as well, and the governor associations have adopted this so that you can then demonstrate and then practice instead of waiting until something happens right there in your system. So it's like we want a Major League Baseball team and a whole group of these, and we're still building out the T-ball leagues, okay? So we're building all of these simultaneously, and some of the solutions are going to take longer, especially as it relates to the accreditation and the professionalization of what is happening. Now, Congressman Hurd brought up job descriptions, and that there isn't a common job description. That is actually under the initiative of the National Initiative for Cybersecurity Education, where they've taken what DoD's doing, what are in the civilian sectors, and bringing that together. And so there is criteria now associated with that. The challenge is that if you were coming into the federal government, you would not know to look for a 2210 series with a parenthetical that says cybersecurity, okay? That's the challenge that's happening. So it's easier for you to go to the private sector.
Well, I would just say, having dealt with this problem of competing with the private sector for talent, and if the government's short 15,000 cybersecurity, the private sector's short 500,000, of which 15 would be a subset of that, which means they're going to go after people, young people, offer them a lot of money. Trying to get people in government is tough, but I found people still want to come into government and at different stages of their career. Now, when I came into government, you stayed because there was a pension at the end of 30 years. That doesn't exist any longer. But getting people to come into government by listening to people who've been there, people like myself and the rest of the panelists, who will tell you there's nothing more rewarding they've done in life, other than maybe coaching youth sports or raising their kids, than working in the federal government or in government. And I always tell people, if you worked in the private sector and you've made enough money, come into the government, you'll find two things. One, it's the hardest job you've ever done. And two, it's the thing you'll be most proud of the rest of your life. And getting those people by going out to the universities and recruiting and telling these people about that government experience, even if you come in for 5 years, you're just going to be so happy you did. And frankly, the private sector enormously values government experience. Now, I don't know if we're teaching them all the right things in terms of the skill sets they need, but in terms of recruiting them, we've got to be out there. And we've got to create other incentives, tuition paid, other things we can do to get them into government.
Yep. And the concept of the net guard is trying to, in addition to give more capability to the government, especially at the time of an emergency, is also designed to get people to really focus on cyber education, because they can get their loans repaid if they go through a strong program. I'd also say that I kind of divide your question in two parts. One is the cyber leaders of the world, and the other are the people that are going to be the cyber work users in the workforce. And you mentioned, Jim, our kids. I mean, I have 3 kids that are going through public schools. They don't teach coding, in public schools as sort of a basic skill, but that's basically how we're all going to live our lives for the next several decades until they invent some other computing paradigm. And so having sort of working, and one of the initiatives that Karen works on is taking this from colleges down to high schools and elementary schools to try to think about this as an educational life cycle.
And I will add that one of the things that we could do, which is, for example, there's government programs, right, for like Head Start and things like that. Once we decide what it is, then you can make that a requirement in the Head Start program, which means now you're exposing children, right, without any kind of idea about what computers are all about into a science, technology, education, engineering, math type of curriculum. And then that's how you start growing the longer term piece. So there's a lot of pieces that are underway, but the short answer is right now, that has to change.
Time for one more question here. Saw 2 hands.
So my question would be like, how far is like America from the idea of connected cities that, for example, Cisco has proposed, and are these policies enough to cover that aspirational thought, maybe?
Yeah, so I think that we're learning from cities around the world. There are examples of that, especially in programs and particular service delivery. I don't think we've come to sort of the I'll use 22nd century, right? If we all say 21st century, I'll go to the 22nd. The cognitive city, the idea that you've got this sort of city where you as an individual can look across city services and have perfect and secure interactions in an agile way. But that's the aspiration we're moving toward. We're seeing models of this around the world. Obviously, we know that in Denmark this is working. In Singapore this is something they're looking at. In Australia. So we're learning, I think, from what's happening, and there's progress at the local level. So I think, again, this is one where we're trying to get that slope of the progress to increase, hopefully to increase so it's more exponential and less incremental.
I would just say, as you're building smart cities, we used to say don't make security a bolt-on later on. Yeah. It's got to be built in. And as everything becomes more and more connected, you're more dependent upon technology. I don't know if anybody here has ever read the book 1 Second After. It's somebody sets off a nuclear bomb that sends electromagnetic pulse that kills all electronics in continental United States. I mean, literally in one moment, planes fall out of the sky, cars stop, all electronics, all communications is gone in the United States. And if you're building all these smart cities, but they're still vulnerable, whether it's an EMP or some other major attack, everything's connected, everything goes down. So I have in reserve a 1965 car, which is cyber impenetrable.
All right, well, we're out of time here. I want you all to join me in thanking our fantastic panel, and thank you all for coming.